Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about the new revised and expanded edition of God and the Gay Christian, written by Matthew Vines. This originally came out back in 2014. It's 2025 as I record this, so it's a little over 10 years old. And the publisher, Convergent, reached out to me because they knew about my channel and thought that I might like to do a review of this title, and I agreed. So that's how I got this in my hands. Thank you to Convergent for sending me a review copy. This is going to be my honest take on this book. So what I'll do is I'll step you through my typical format. I will comment a little bit about who the author is. I will summarize the main idea of the book and the argument here, talk a bit about the research, talk a bit about the readability, and then finally jump into my reaction, kind of my overall reaction at the end. And that's going to be a bit longer. There's a lot to react to here that I want to be very thoughtful and precise and careful about. So I'm going to do an extended reaction section. So if that's all you're interested in, just jump to the end there. I'll have it all time-stamped, but I will go through all those other sections first. So let's jump in to this one. I know this is controversial territory I'm wading into, so I want to try to speak generously and carefully. But Matthew Vines, first of all, is head of something that's called the Reformation Project. The first time I heard of him was at the publication of this book back in 2014. But, and this is important for my review, I never read the original version. I knew of it. I had talked to some people who had read it. I generally knew kind of what the argument was, but I never read it. And so one of the reasons I was glad for the chance to review it is because I was coming into it really, pretty fresh in the sense that I had not read their original version. Though I secondarily, from my kind of secondary observations, I always appreciated what I observed of Vine's posture and kind of his grace and generosity in the conversation, as tense as it is. I appreciated his way of arguing. So anyway, so that's kind of my background. Very little background directly, but I did know about this argument and was interested in reading the second edition to see kind of what maybe he brought to it in the 10 intervening years since publication, how maybe he would revisit the argument. So his Reformation Project, I should also say, is very much tailored around trying to encourage Christians with a high view of Scripture to embrace an affirming view of same-sex union, same-sex marriage. So he's trying to kind of chart, not a middle way, I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but he's trying to hold a high view of Scripture with an unapologetically affirming view of same-sex marriage and marriage covenants, and arguing that Christians should, even conservative Christians, when it comes to conservative attitudes towards Scripture, should be able to affirm those unions. So that's what his Reformation Project is all about. He's really trying to argue and contend for that change. Anyway, so, and this book is kind of his big text, kind of his big argument around that when it comes to Scripture. So that's a little bit about who the author is. Now let me jump into the main idea of this book. It's pretty clear. Many of you are probably familiar with this book, or at least have heard of it. But the subtitle is A Biblical Case in Support of Same-Sex Relationships. So that pretty much says what he's doing right there. But what he does in this book is I would say very carefully walk through the most prominent Scripture, the 6 most well-known Scriptures: Old Testament, Leviticus, New Testament, Romans 1, the epistles where Paul talks about various sins. He does address all of that, and he does it, I would say, very carefully, and especially in the sense of recovering the ancient context in which those scriptures were written. He does a lot of work trying to recover the ancient mindset and attitude around sexual activity and arguing whether or not sexual orientation as we think of it today is applicable to even interpreting and understanding what the original writers of Scripture had in their minds when they talked about it. So there's chapters that march kind of systematically through each of those very famous biblical passages. But there's also a lot, it's not only an exegetical book in the sense of it's not just about here's what these Bible verses mean and here's how to imply them and reinterpret them. He also brings in a good bit of autobiography, self-reflective elements, talking about his own story with his parents when he came out to his parents, and his parents wrestling with their view of Scripture and how that applied to their attitude towards their son. And there's a lot of discussion of, there is some discussion of tradition. My understanding, in having kind of researched this version as compared to the original version, there's a whole new chapter on just the idea of tradition and Christian orthodoxy, and how can someone adopt an affirming view and still consider themselves orthodox. So he does talk about theological tradition and the handing down of tradition. He talks about the idea of orthodoxy. He does talk a bit about defining marriage more theologically. He talks a bit about gender, not as much, but there's some discussion of gender and especially the gender roles that were known in the ancient world. So it's more than just a kind of limited, dry discussion of a few biblical passages. That makes up the bulk of the center of the book, but there's chapters at the beginning and chapters at the end that do more of the, I would say, bigger picture theological work. Ultimately, though, he is arguing for a high view of respecting Scripture and high view of respecting church tradition, actually, as well as a full-throated case to say we can affirm same-sex marriages in the church while holding to a high view of Scripture. And one of the ways he does that, which I'll revisit this in my reaction thoughts at the end, but one of the ways he does that is he brings out the tension between our conception of sexual orientation and identity today, and he essentially argues that the biblical writers had no concept of how we think of that today, and so therefore we can't simplistically apply those prohibitions to behavior today. He argues that enforcing celibacy for people based on an orientation, which again is largely foreign to the biblical writers, the idea of an orientation, the idea of this inward orientation that you can't repress or expunge or get rid of, because that was foreign to the biblical writers, and the way the biblical writers talk about celibacy is voluntary. Like, it's not biblical to enforce celibacy based on something like a sexual orientation, which is not even in the view of the biblical writers. That's another plank of his argument. And he essentially argues that the principles of marriage, he contends for a certain view definition of marriage based on certain principles of self-giving love and commitment and faithfulness and fidelity. And he argues that, and this is a common argument, but he argues that those things can be expressed in a same-sex relationship just as much as they can be expressed in a heterosexual relationship. And so therefore you're not fundamentally, in his argument, redefining marriage to affirm a same-sex union. So those are some of the big planks of his argument, based on some of that exegetical and historical work that he does. So hopefully that's a helpful summary for kind of the way he's getting at this, the way he's getting at his views here. But let's keep going. Let's keep marching forward. Okay, quickly, I'll do these next two. I'll try to do these next two quickly so I have more time. Yeah, this is going to get long. So I have more time for my reaction thoughts because that's where I have a lot to say. But the research. Okay, the research pleasantly surprised me in one particular way. So I expected this book to be exegetical. I expected him to get into the language. I expected him to get into words like arsenikoi, tai, malakoi that Paul uses in his letters. I expected him to get into the nature argument, physis, however you pronounce that in the Greek, in Romans 1. I expected him to talk about the relevance of Levitical laws. I expected him to talk about Sodom and Gomorrah and all of that. Like, I expected all of that biblical work to be there, and it is. And it's generally solid. The thing that pleasantly surprised... that didn't surprise me. What did surprise me is his really careful work in exhuming the ancient context. This I wasn't expecting in the book, and this is one of... I'll say more in the reaction, but this is one of the stronger elements of the book for me, is he goes to great pains to differentiate modern psychological identity, sense of orientation, and sexual desire. He goes to great pains to differentiate that carefully and precisely from what the ancient world understood of human identity, human longing, the idea of sexual orientation and sexual behavior. And there's some really good research into the ancient world and the ancient context. And especially in the appendices, there's two appendices in particular where he responds to generally conservative evangelicals like N.T. Wright and Preston Sprinkle, who have argued that there was a conception of same-sex orientation in the ancient world, and so in their argument, it's inappropriate to just say, well, we're talking about something different today, so the Bible doesn't apply. He responds to that argument very well, very carefully, with an impressive array of research. He marshals good evidence, I think, really good evidence that that the ancient world really didn't have the same conception, and that lends a layer of serious complexity to when we think about applying and interpreting those biblical passages to how we understand sexual behavior and sexual identity today. So that's what I wanted to highlight about the research that I thought was particularly notable about this book, and I think very, very good. The readability of it is also very good in the sense of being very easy to understand, very easy to digest. The research is I would say the research is of academic quality, but the writing is of invitational, conversational, winsome, inviting quality. And a lot of that is due to his reflective nature and his willingness to kind of tell his own story, tells anecdotes, and he writes very compellingly. I have to say, he writes very empathetically, very compassionately. He is not overly cynical, not overly harsh to people he disagrees with. I think he's generous. I think he has a good posture and a good tone. And in such a fraught debate, such a fraught conversation, I just think that is refreshing, and I commend him for the writing style, the readability. I read this very quickly. It's also just very interesting and very, I would say gentle, but convinced and firm. And I like that tone. So yeah, good readability. Okay, now let's dig into my reaction thoughts here. So I want to say a couple things that are I want to say two in particular positive things about this book, my takeaways from it, some things that he really moved the needle for me on. And then I want to spend some time responding to things that I did not find convincing and why. And I want to talk about that very carefully. I am somebody, I've alluded to this. I don't think that I've ever reviewed, I'm trying to think. I've not reviewed a book explicitly on the same-sex marriage question, I suppose. I've alluded to the fact that I hold to a more traditional understanding of sexual ethics when it comes to understanding scripture and Christian tradition and all of that. But I've never really explicated that on this channel. And so I want to do that very carefully because I know this is such a lightning rod. But I still, after having read this book, I still hold to a traditional understanding of sexuality, sexual ethics, and I want to talk about why, and the things that I ultimately did not find convincing about this book is how I'm going to end this review. But first, there are two specific things that I really found convincing, actually, that I think are really helpful. And I will say too, I'm also very glad I read this, all told. So first of all, I alluded to this a few minutes ago in the research section, but he convinced me straight up that the argument that, the ancient world knew about sexual orientation because, Nero married a boy that he dressed up as a woman, for example. That's one argument that I've heard. The argument that, the ancient world knew about sexual orientation, and so it's condescending to say they didn't know they didn't know about sexual orientation, so we should stop saying that. He convinced me that argument does not hold water. And he did a really, really good job, especially in those appendices, at carefully marshaling evidence. And he does it in a way that he's not arguing for anachronism or condescension or kind of that chronological snobbery that C.S. Lewis talks about. He's not arguing for that. He's really trying to just make the straight up case that the idea that someone's orientation is kind of fixed and is defined more on internal phenomenological experiential levels, and that they have this almost immutable orientation towards one gender or another, and the kind of psychologized definition of that we live in and that we imbibe culturally right now. He just takes great pains to just say, that is just not what the ancient world thought at all. And he convinced me of that. And so I really have kind of changed my perception of that argument because of this book. And he does a really good job. And he does it in a way that's patient and careful and well-researched. And I think he even acknowledges, Preston Sprinkle has acknowledged, I think, in response to Matthew Vines, that Matthew Vines makes some very compelling cases or points that have kind of even adjusted some of Sprinkle's views. And so that's one of the strongest, I think, single strongest aspects of this book. And he advances the overall conversation in that particular venue. And I would say, and I'm going to continue to say, we need to not use that argument. Particularly those of us who land on a more traditional side of this need to not just lazily say, the ancient world knew about same-sex orientation, so we can apply the verses just into our context simply. So that's one thing he convinced me of. Second thing he convinced me of is on the celibacy point. He handled that really well. And I think I would have said before I read this book that I had some latent discomfort with the way we simplistically prescribe celibacy to someone, traditional people at least can simplistically prescribe that to people with same-sex orientation, same-sex attraction. But I think he does a really good and careful job explaining why enforcing celibacy upon someone, especially because it's rooted on this idea of orientation, which again is something that we occupy in our cultural context that's not fitting to the ancient world, to then take this idea of celibacy, which is very clearly presented as an idea of something that's like a calling and a gifting to people, and not to be enforced by an ecclesiastical hierarchy, especially. He just does a really good job dismantling that idea that, well, we just need to enforce celibacy to people with same-sex attraction, and that's how you deal with it. And I think he does a great job saying that that's simply not, that like the biblical basis for that approach is just not very solid, and kind of redefines even what the gift of and the calling of celibacy actually is and even means. So that's another thing that he convinced me of, and another thing that I'm going to be very, hopefully more thoughtful and more careful about when I think about these issues moving forward. So those are the two strongest things about this book, in my view, is like his clear differentiation of what sexual orientation means to us versus the ancient world, and then pushing back hard on this whole like prescribed celibacy as a way to move forward for people with same-sex attraction. So yeah, gosh, this review's already gotten long, but let's go to the things that I did not find convincing. And there's kind of two broad things I didn't find convincing that ultimately I put the book down and I'm not quite on the same page with his overall argument on. And those two things are his attempt to redefine marriage, that's one, and the second thing is the much bigger framework of his argument, which is the tree, this idea of a bad tree bearing bad fruit. That's the thing I really want to unpack, so I'm going to talk about that at the end. But first, redefine his notion of redefining marriage. I mentioned a few minutes ago that he kind of works towards this idea of defining marriage more on the basis of kind of the virtues of marriage that can be embodied in a same-sex relationship just as much as in a heterosexual relationship. So virtues like self-giving love and sacrifice. That is a very common argument in this venue, in this sphere, and I've heard that before, and he approaches it thoughtfully, but he did not really, in my view, do enough to make a case that marriage can be redefined based only on those abstract virtues, and kind of redefining the body, and especially gendered bodies, just out of a definition of marriage. He did not convince me that we can so easily kind of take that element out of marriage. And one of the reasons is because he did not spend enough time really discussing the sacramental nature of the marriage act and the sacramental history of it, why it's a sacrament and what that sacrament points to. He does acknowledge I don't know that he ever even uses the word sacrament, but he does acknowledge that marriage has historically had this view of, and that some people have contended that gender difference is essential to that definition of marriage historically, but I wish that he had addressed more head on where the sacrament comes from and how the sacrament has been historically understood, and how the sacrament points, like, the definition of sacraments being a outward manifestation of an invisible reality, the sacrament of marriage pointing to the union of Christ and the church, and the way that has been created. This is kind of theology of the body stuff, John Paul II, but the way that that's been created in the male and female image-bearing capacity of humans. He did not convince me that that's not still an important part of the sacrament of marriage, and he does discuss all that stuff on pages 154 to 155 in particular, but it's a short section that deals with what it means to bear the image of God, and he kind of uses some simplistic arguments that, like, sex difference is also in animals, so therefore that can't be what it means. The male-female sex difference in humanity can't really have any, like, particular image-bearing, ontological meaning, and I just didn't find that convincing enough. I didn't find that it took the history of the sacramental act of marriage seriously enough, and I don't think it dealt with the full biblical witness of marriage importantly enough. Like the marriage theme, arguably from Genesis 1 to the last chapters of Revelation and Ephesians 5. The big kind of meta-narrative, historical, scriptural view of marriage and the thematic view of marriage and what it represents and what it points to. I just think there's really rich sacramental Christian understandings of that he didn't interact with enough to convince me that we can redefine marriage based on these abstracted virtues that don't need to be embodied in the male-female union. And that's why another plank of his argument is these ideas of historical reforms that the church has gone through. So like the reform around heliocentrism, for example, was a big deal, and he's right to point out that, like, there's clear biblical case to be made that the earth is the center of the universe, and that the church reforming its notion of that was and is a big deal, and that he makes that kind of analogy to his reformation that he's contending for, that we need to undergo a similar reformation, but this time around our understanding of marriage. The reason I get the analogy, but the reason for me it doesn't really hold water is because heliocentrism, when you look at the scriptural witness and the history, there's no sacramental act that's based on understanding geocentrism versus heliocentrist cosmos. There's no sacrament that is linked to that, but there is a sacrament that's linked to marriage, which is presented biblically consistently through the narrative of Scripture in a certain way that, to me, it's a category mistake to put those two things next to each other in the analogy that he's trying to make. And so that's why, for me, that particular plank of the argument did not move the needle and convince me. But what I really want to land on here, I knew this was going to be a long review. Thanks for hanging with me if you're still on this. But this is a really important conversation, and I'm trying to give this book its full merit and respond in kind. And so what I want to end on is his framing device that he uses, which is in, I think, the first chapter, where he talks about the tree and the fruit. And he talks about the Sermon on the Mount and how a bad tree bears bad fruit, a good tree bears good fruit. And this is a really important aspect of his argument, and it's why I want to end my review here, because essentially he's arguing that the fruit we can see in kind of, especially American evangelicalism, in the ways that same-sex attracted and gay Christians struggle so much psychologically. They struggle with ostracization and marginalization and sometimes abuse, and all of that stuff is real. And he uses this framing device to say these realities, these experiences, are the bad fruit. And they're bad fruit of something, and so we need to identify the tree. And he identifies the tree as the church culture and the church teachings and the church interpretation of Scripture. And I'm sympathetic to that argument, and I do think I would not argue that gay people have not been mistreated. I would never argue that. I mean, I've known people personally that have gone through that, and I have seen that happen. Much to my shame, when I was in high school, I'm a 90s kid. I went to high school in the early 2000s, and I participated in a lot of homophobic joking in youth group settings. So I hate that happened, but I also understand how much the church has cultivated, in some cases, a very poisonous culture towards same-sex attracted and LGBT people, and I would never argue that that's not the case. So I want to say that very clearly before I push back on his framing device here in his argument. The way I would push back on what he's saying is that I don't actually think that argument goes deep enough. To identify the tree as just the church and the church's culture, I do not think goes deep enough. I think there is a tree that is producing bad fruit, and I would say the tree is actually our broader culture, namely, you call it Western culture, you call it late modern culture, you call it meta-modern culture is sometimes what people are using. I think the tree in this case is the culture within which the American evangelical church is rooted. And I think to the extent that the church has some bad cultural elements, it's drawing from the broader culture and has not been critical and discerning enough around the broader culture that the church is in. I think that is the tree. And I think our cultural assumptions that get imported into the practice of the church and the ecclesiastical structures of the church and all that, cultural assumptions around things like intimacy, like individual identity, like sex and what sex is for and what sex means and how it's supposed to be experienced and how all of these things cohere into a sense of flourishing. There's a lot of assumptions in our cultural tree, so to speak, that I would argue the church has not been nearly careful and discerning enough, not biblical enough in its discernment, not critical enough, and therefore there's been bad fruit in some of our bad teachings and some of our bad pop theology. That I'm sympathetic to his arguments on, but I just don't think his framing device is correct. And that's where a lot of the argument really then does not really hold water ultimately. And what I want to do is I want to read some quotes that hopefully get at what I'm talking about, because to me, this was popping up a lot throughout the course of the book, namely that his book makes a lot of assumptions about what flourishing human identity, sexual behavior, there's a lot of assumptions that he makes that are aped uncritically from our culture that I think need to be part of the conversation. And so to me, the book doesn't have a big enough, expansive enough vision of that stuff. So let me read some quotes to kind of get at what I'm saying here, and I'll flesh that out and some concluding thoughts at the end. So on page 9, He says, in narrating his own story, I was blessed by my parents' continued love, but absent a significant change from my dad in particular, we were likely to end up stuck in the same place. Compassion, but no support for a future romantic relationship. There's a little bit of an assumption in there that what he needed was support for a future romantic relationship in order for there to be some hope for his life moving forward. He has this quote where he's talking about the chapter on celibacy, which again I said was largely convincing. But on page 57 he says, given the concerns of the church fathers, this is the patristics, given their concerns, is it any wonder that many gay Christians who are told to detest all of their sexual desires also grow to detest their very existence as embodied sexual beings? That's a revealing quote too, because he makes that link between detesting your sexual desires to detesting essentially yourself. That's I would argue, a symptom of a lot of cultural stuff that's going on that's bigger than actually the evangelical church. Two more quotes. Page 109, he says in the chapter on Romans 1, he's talking about how the prescriptions, telling gay Christians that they can't pursue romantic relationships, and comparing that to why straight people, heterosexual people pursue romantic relationships. Where does this leave gay Christians who seek committed relationships? They don't desire same-sex relationships because they've grown tired of heterosexuality and are seeking a new outlet for their insatiable lusts, which is what he's arguing Romans 1's all about. But he says they pursue same-sex unions for the same reasons straight Christians pursue opposite-sex unions. They desire intimacy, companionship, and long-term commitment. There's an assumption baked into that the only place to get intimacy, companionship, and long-term commitment is in a single marriage relationship with one other person. I think there's an assumption built into that. And I want to be very compassionate to people who have received, and I'm also married, so I have that awareness as I say all this, but I want to have compassion to people who have received the kind of cultural assumption, that conventional wisdom, so to speak, that this is the channel through which you receive those things, and then to say, well, gay people can't have access to that, like that creates significant psychological pain. But I want to back up a bit and revisit those cultural assumptions that are lending us in that direction, because I don't think Scripture, all told, the biblical presentation of Scripture actually makes that same assumption. I don't think that there's any reason to say you can't experience deep intimacy and companionship without ever being married. I think the biblical view of singleness totally upholds all of those values and virtues. But there's one more quote that I want to read before I try to round out this review, and that's near the end on page 156. This is in his kind of near closing chapter on just his biblical case for why we can affirm same-sex marriage, and this to me is a very, very, very revealing quote. The fundamental problem with rejecting same-sex marriage is not that it denies gay Christians the possibility of satisfying their desires. The deeper problem is that it denies gay Christians a unique possibility for sanctification and for true self-denial and service to another. That, to me, is very revealing, because he straight out says that when we deny the possibility of marriage, we're denying a unique possibility for sanctification. And so the assumption there is that marriage is that unique possibility for sanctification, and you remove it, that's actually like deeply harmful for the discipleship and the growth of an individual. And if he's right that marriage is this unique possibility for that, then I would say it is malpractice to say that it's not possible for some people to get married and to enforce that from the top down. But that's a big assumption. It's a big assumption to say marriage is this unique path for the only way you can experience sanctification in this one way is through marriage. And I think that assumption comes from the broader culture. And again, I don't think the church has been critical enough, especially in its attitude towards heterosexual people and just general kind of sexual ethics and marriage ethics and covenant support and all of that stuff. The church has not been nearly critical enough in those kind of deeper assumptions, cultural assumptions. But I think that is the tree that's bearing the bad fruit, not just the evangelical church and the way the church interprets scriptures is not producing all this bad fruit. I think the bad fruit, if we want to assess blame for the psychological burdens of people in our culture, I am all about leveling blame on the church when it's appropriate, but I don't want to limit the possibility of the blame being actually bigger than the church in some cases. And that's just very much the way I felt in reading this book. I kept thinking that there is this baked-in assumption that marriage is this possibility for flourishing, marriage is this possibility for expression of this kind of orientation in a committed covenant sense to experience that companionship and that intimacy. And that assumption, I think, is driving a lot of the argument then that he's backfilling to make a biblical case for supporting redefining marriage, which I talked about why I didn't find that convincing, redefining marriage to allow it for people in kind of same-sex relationships to experience. But I just want to back up. I want to back up the truck, so to speak, and examine some of those assumptions first before we go about redefining something that is such a important sacramental and historical act as the marriage covenant. And so yeah, that's why I ultimately found I found pieces of this argument convincing and helpful, but I found the overarching kind of the thrust of the argument not convincing. But what I want to say as I round out this review, and if you've hung with me for this long, thank you. I'm genuinely glad I read this book because I understand where Matthew Vines is coming from even more now. I think this book genuinely advances the conversation in shedding some clarity on a few specific pieces. I think the things that convinced me on are things I'm going to stop. To the extent I was using them for arguments, I'm not going to use them anymore. The things that I talked about a few minutes ago. And in that way, I find that this book is illuminating in some important ways. And I think ultimately traditional arguments, traditionally minded, historic, ethical arguments need to take his criticisms into account and take them seriously and allow his criticisms to be compelling in certain ways so that our arguments are, because I represent kind of that side in this video, our arguments can be more holistic, more carefully constructed, not cheap arguments, not deploying bad jumps in logic or bad history, bad historical evidence. And ultimately, what I want to do is argue in that tree and fruit. I want to use that same analogy that I use because I think it's helpful, but I want to identify with more clarity and precision and care what the actual tree is and why it's bearing actual bad fruit, because diagnosing that incorrectly is not going to actually help our situation. And sadly, that's kind of what I think is going on in this book. And I will say, like, I think part of what's going to come with that, if we diagnose the tree in the direction that I've kind of been talking, like diagnose the tree as our more broader cultural assumptions about sex and identity and happiness and flourishing and companionship and all that stuff, if we're going to go in that direction, that's going to mean a lot of more difficult discipleship conversations for straight heterosexual people, which I think I would probably agree with. I'm sure he would agree with me on this, that we have not been nearly consistent. We, meaning like pastors and church leaders, have not been nearly consistent enough in holding all people to the same high sexual ethic bar. And that is going to result in uncomfortable discipleship conversations, first with heterosexual people and heterosexual couples that need to be called to account in a discipleship sense, before we just too quickly jump to LGBT people who have been maligned unfairly in so many ways and focused on too much in other ways. So that's kind of where my general takeaways are from this book. And I want to say, like, if you resonate with my way of thinking there, I've read a lot of books on this, but two that jump to mind that I find maybe underappreciated and very helpful along these lines that I'm talking about identifying the deeper issues going on, are Wesley Hill's book, Spiritual Friendship. It's an extraordinarily powerful reflection on the search for companionship outside of marriage, and he reveals some of these assumptions in our culture and things that need to change. And similarly, The End of Sexual Identity by Janelle Paris, a very underappreciated book, but I think one that's really helpful on starting to interrogate some of these broader issues. So I would commend those books to you if you've read this whole, or if you listen to this whole review and you find any of that compelling or interesting. But I have taken on way long enough of your time, but I really wanted to give this one some adequate time and careful response. So I hope you found this helpful. If you disagree with me, I hope at least I articulated my thoughts in a way that you can understand where I'm coming from and that you can see the careful thought that I put into responding to this book, which is also a careful and thoughtful book. But as always, thanks for taking a few or more than a few minutes in this case to watch.